Our second speaker this evening is Dr. Gene Fant, who is the Executive Vice President for Academic Administration and Professor of English here at Union University. As a consummate teacher in literature and also as a regular contributor to ongoing conversations about Christianity and the liberal arts, both for the magazine First Things and for the Chronicle of Higher Education, and as the author of two important works in the same arena, one of them being The Liberal Arts, A Student's Guide, and also God as Author, A Biblical Approach to Narrative, I know of few individuals who are better equipped to tackle our next topic than Dr. Fant. It is an understatement of perhaps epic proportions to say that C.S. Lewis loved books. I think that's probably the understatement of the night. So it's difficult to imagine a better source than Lewis for addressing Dr. Fant's topic, which is why reading broadly matters. Lewis was especially fond of old books. This is partly because he thought that the reading of old books protected us against an error that his friend Owen Barfield called chronological snobbery, which Lewis described as the uncritical acceptance of the intellectual climate common to our own age and the assumption that whatever has gone out of date is on that account discredited. Chronological snobbery, just incidentally, is becoming worse and worse during the digital revolution because usually what's out of date for more than about 5 or 6 seconds is usually counted as discredited. In an essay entitled Learning in Wartime, Lewis wrote this, quote, "Most of all, perhaps, we need intimate knowledge of the past, not that the past has any magic about it, but because we cannot study the future. And yet, we need something to set against the present, to remind us that the basic assumptions have been quite different in different periods, and that much of what seems certain to the uneducated is merely temporary fashion. A man who has lived in many places is not likely to be deceived by the local errors of his native village. The scholar has lived in many times and many places, and therefore is in some degree immune from the great cataract of nonsense that pours from the press and microphone of his own age." End quote. Now for Lewis, this was not mere advice, for he embodied his own wisdom in the breadth of what he himself read. In fact, what he read in his life was just staggering. And so also it is with Dr. Fant. He embodies this wisdom as well. And that is why I'm delighted that he is here tonight mining the depths of his own studies in C.S. Lewis, together with his distinguished career in reading, teaching, and writing about literature, to bring his talk to us this evening, C.S. Lewis and Literature, Why Reading Broadly Matters. Will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Gene Fant?
Well, thank you for that introduction. I feel like my mother must have emailed you with things to say, which is a beauty. And is the microphone working now? I didn't hear it at first, so good. I have an alternate lecture I thought about providing us for this occasion, which is why I hate C.S. Lewis, which goes along with the chronological snobbery thing, which is, it seems like every time I think I'm coming up with an original idea, I'll mention it to a friend, and the friend will say, well, you know, C.S. Lewis already said that, right, in book 47, part B, or whatever. And if it's not Lewis, it's G.K. Chesterton or whatever, and it's extremely frustrating to live in such an environment. But instead, what I wanted to do this evening is to talk about Lewis and reading, and really, Lewis will only be about the last third of what I'm going to say, because I want to set the table for why Lewis is so important for us and why Lewis reminds us about why reading a lot of different things, reading all the time, is really such an important thing. As an English professor, of course, I have a real affinity to C.S. Lewis. My specialty area was in 17th century literature. I had a minor subsection in medieval literature as well, and so When I was going through my doctoral program, I have several Lewis works that are cited in my dissertation and so forth. And it was really not until after I got out of graduate school I was able to kind of dig in on some of the other novel things. I did not grow up in a household that had a lot of, we had Mere Christianity, but that was about it that was around. We just were not exposed to a lot of his writings or Tolkien or anything. I did not grow up reading The Hobbit. I read it the first time when I taught ninth grade English. And that was much to my poverty, but also to my great joy as I began to discover those things a lot later in life when I was maybe a little bit better equipped to understand what was going on with them. What's really interesting to me is in my literature classes, there would be this really bizarre begrudging of Lewis. Oh, I see you've read Lewis. Like, you know, it's such an embarrassment. He's a preacher. And how many times I've heard people who are not Christians say that. Lewis, that preacher, which, you know, is sort of true, but he would be absolutely baffled to be called anything other than a professor, an essayist, a novelist, and so forth. But I want to focus in on something a little bit kind of catty-cornered in what I'm going to do this evening, and that is look at this idea that Christians should read broadly, that this is a part of being well-educated and so forth, because really this is a part of why Lewis is somewhat controversial in certain Christian circles. Because, you know, hey, what could be controversial about that? Well, let me illustrate that with an anecdote myself. I had a parent come visit my office, as I do in my role as Chief Academic Officer, and the parent came in and sat down and said, I'm really concerned about what's happening in my students' literature course. And I said, okay, well, I was expecting, you know, who knows what. I mean, good golly, I'm sure they were in like Scott Hewlin's class or Gavin Richardson's class or something. And the mother said, I was looking through the textbook that my student's been assigned, and the textbook includes stories and poems by non-Christian writers. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't quite understand your question. And she said, you have students read non-Christian writers? And I said, well, yeah. And she said, well, isn't the Bible story enough or text enough for all that we ever need? And I said, well, I can give you a really long, in fact, I reached around and grabbed a copy of one of the books that I wrote and handed it to her. It's like, thank you for disvaluing my entire life's work. Try to read it, maybe you'll, you know, get it. In fact, I have a relative who subscribes to this view as well, that the Bible is text enough and we don't need anything else. And when my book God as Author came out, I gave this fellow a copy of it and you know, and said, you know, to so-and-so, I won't say his name since it's being videoed. And he all but handed it back to me and said, why would I read this? I have the Bible. Why would I read anything else? And, you know, in that moment, he was basically saying, I belittle your life's calling. Thank you very much. And I was very pleased to have that word. Well, when I follow down the path with folks who come from that sort of a perspective, what often they will say is, well, you know, Lewis was a heretic. And there are some passages Lewis writes about that have come under lots of scrutiny. In fact, you can Google C.S. Lewis plus heresy and find hundreds and hundreds of hits for that, where they describe what looks like apparently a kind of soft universalism. There were some other things that were going on in different works of his. And then I'll have others who will say, well, you do know he's like an Anglican, right? You know, and so I kind of think that's funny as well. And so they'll go on and they'll go through with all this. In fact, I kind of think of when Shakespeare wrote the play Julius Caesar, he's got this great line in there where they're complaining about this one character and they finally sum up why they don't trust the guy. They say, well, you know, he reads too much. And again, I really think that's good. Well, to be fair, I do want to spend some time talking about the bit of logic to the argument that they're making, because there is a logic to what they're arguing when they say that, especially when you view the cultural context of the early church, the first century context in which they were living and working and trying to witness. And so let me go through a few of these things. For instance, in the pagan world, the pre-Christian worldview that dominated the early church, the theology that was in the middle of it was the theology of Jove. And I don't know if you've ever read a lot about what Jove did, but Jove was one heinous dude. He was just awful. When I taught school at one time, I was one of the One of the hall monitor guys, they had to break up the fights. Y'all remember in high school, the enforcer guys, the coaches? I was a coach, Coach Fant. I still think that's funny. But when there would be a fight in the hallway, they'd go, Coach Fant, Hall D, please. And I'd go and I'd bust up the guys. And I remember one time busting up a fight between two guys who were wearing WWJD bracelets, and I thought this was really comical, And it's okay to laugh. Thank you very much. There we go. All right. Well, the J is very different if the J is Jove instead of Jesus. What would Jove do is a completely different universe than what would Jesus do. For instance, let me just give you this example. This is from Ovid, from the Metamorphoses, Jove and Io. Jove sees a beautiful young woman, and he begins to then sort of pursue her and kind of lay out his Mac lines on her and talks about, hey, don't be afraid. I am not a common god. I am the one who holds the scepter of heaven. Don't flee, but of course then she flees and stuff, and so he basically turns himself into a veil of fog, and he conceals the land, and then he grabs her and rapes her right there. Well, that's a lovely image for us to have as edification, is it not? And the Metamorphoses is filled with images like this of debauchery, of drunkenness, of all kinds of orgiastic activities and all. And this is, in fact, the context in which the early church was looking. So, in the Metamorphoses, which are written about the year 8, so when basically Jesus was a toddler, this is the cultural context into which the New Testament writers were addressing their concerns. And so when you get to a book like 1 Peter that's really talking about living life in this world, in this culture, he talks about the importance of Christ's suffering in his body, that we are to have the same attitude of Christ that suffered in his body and be done with sin. And so we should not live our lives for evil human desires, but instead live for the will of God. This is a specific statement going contrary to the dominant culture in which these folks were living. The dominant culture was, hey, whatever you want, it's okay, because the gods have done the same thing. If you're to emulate the gods, then you are going to be able to do whatever you want. Look at what Peter continues to say then. You have spent enough time in the past doing what the pagans choose to do. Debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, detestable idolatry. It's just like the frat that was behind my dorm when I was in college. It's like their mission statement right here, 1 Peter. They think it's strange that you do not plunge in with them. And I remember being in that when I was a freshman and I went to my first fraternity party and I'm walking in the door and I am seeing things I've never seen before in my Southern Baptist pastor's household. And when I was handed something at the door and I said, no thanks, I don't, immediately I was viewed with suspicion. And these folks do that. They think it's strange. They wonder what is wrong with you. They heap abuse on you and so forth. But they, just as you will have to give account to him who's ready to judge. I should have put the King James up here, the quick and the dead, which is a much better rendering of that than just the living and the dead. Well, Peter is working with this worldview. Philippians comes back here from Paul, and it talks about the things that we need to stress in our lives. We need to stress what's true. We need to stress what's noble, what's right, what's pure, what's lovely, what's admirable, all of these things. And this is a direct and total contrast with what they were seeing in the pagan cultures. The pagan cultures were there to tear down basically every moral imperative that we have as Christians. We can see this throughout ancient archaeology. You go to ancient Roman cities and you dig up the sewer systems, and what you will find in the sewer systems are piles and piles of fetal bodies and skeletons. Because if it was a house of prostitution, the boy babies were unnecessary, so they'd get rid of the boy babies, they'd flush them down the sewers, and the sewers would become clogged with the corpses of fetuses. This was the culture in which these folks are writing to the early church. And they're saying, keep yourself away from these things. Find ways in which you can pursue purity and uprightness and righteousness and all that. And the last line of this is extremely important. The God of peace will be with you. In a culture that was chaotic and debauched, a culture that had a hard time, I think, sleeping with itself at night, unless it was medicated, the God of peace is what the Christians had. I've had friends who've asked me that before, do you have trouble sleeping at night? And I always say, I never have trouble sleeping at night. And they talk about their consciences and the little voices that keep them awake at night, accusing them and so forth. And there's a legitimate spiritual thing there. Well, by the time we get into the early church fathers, we get Tertullian. And Tertullian is deeply influential in these ideas. He believed that philosophy was designed by demons to basically trick us all out of our minds and to trick us out of our integrity. And so for him, he basically said that philosophy was the source of all heresies, that it was that we were letting our minds get ahead of ourselves, trusting in our intellect, trusting in the folks who are around us, instead of trusting in the authority of Scripture, the authority of the church itself, and so forth. And so he famously asked this question, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem or the academy with the church? This is the guy who sets up this legacy where people say, why would I have anything to do with anything that is not specifically and totally biblical? Well, there's another guy that comes right after him, Cyprian, about 100 years later, who basically is complaining that classical and pagan stories, the literature, the theater, the artwork, you name it, of all these things, is basically preserving past sins for future weaknesses. This is particularly true about the imagination. It's one of the things that's very interesting to watch as you live your life and you have experiences, is that change from when you're an adolescent and you view particular works of art to when you become older and you have a different perspective on the world and you can view the same art in a very different kind of way. And the same thing with literature. Well, Cyprian was very concerned about moral integrity, very concerned about this idea that we would not be stained by the world, that we would remain unsullied from the world, and so forth. And so Cyprian and Tertullian and the folks who come alongside of them are all basically killing off all of theater, all of the literary tradition that was going on, all of the imaginative kinds of issues that were, or works that were being created. And they were doing it very much in a culture that was still trying to come to terms with how do we live as Christians in a world that hates us. Well, it's right after this time that we end up having Constantine coming into power. Christianity suddenly becomes the dominant world force, and that begins to set the stage for something that is completely and totally different. What happens at that time then is we get this wacky little guy who comes along, and I think I've actually skipped ahead. Yes, so let me go ahead and talk about this. What basis is there for Christians to read broadly, especially non-Christian literary works, things like plays, to view fine arts that are also created by non-Christians and so forth, when those things do not reflect the truths of the faith, or at least the thought is that they don't reflect the truths of the faith. And so as they begin to explore these things and ask these questions, pretty much it goes away for a while. But there's a nagging problem that the church fathers are still dealing with and others in their culture, and that is this. The scriptures themselves make it clear that just because you know pagan things does not mean that you actually accept pagan things. Let me give you 3 examples out of Scripture. The first one comes from Daniel. Daniel and the guys who are at the University of Babylon are going through the entire curriculum, and it's not just that they learn the things, but look at the way Scripture puts this. God gave them knowledge and understanding of all types of literature and learning. God here puts them in the situation, allows them to operate, and allows them to take a moral stance on their food and their drink and probably some other things that go with it. But God himself gives them very unique insights into what is going on in the literature and in the learning there, so that when they come and they take their final exams, they find that they are absolutely cleaning the clock at the top of the school here. I have found this to be true in a lot of different places. In my doctoral program, we had about 100 graduate students, and they had an award that went to the top student every year. And I think for the first 4 years it was offered, all 4 years it was evangelicals who won it. And I heard one of the professors say, if they give this award to a Christian one more time, I'm never going to vote. I thought that was kind of funny. But we were, I think, trying to live up to what Daniel's example was here, that we were doing this. Now, it's not just that Daniel and his friends are taking on this stuff just for the sake of getting along. They're wanting to do it very much for the glory of God. They have a sense of calling, and the idea is that all of this is preparing them for something. In the case of Daniel, it's preparing him for great leadership. Let me give you another example of this. In Acts chapter 7, it flips back to the Old Testament, and it talks about Moses. And talks about how Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. That would be all, and trust me, the Egyptian literature, the Egyptian knowledge is pretty heinous as well. It has lots of very offensive things, offensive to our ideas in it and all. But look what it also says. Moses was powerful in speech and action. He was able and entitled to be able to do the things that he was, specifically because he had been educated in the system of his age, so that he could then have points of contact and communicate effectively in all of these different ways. Well, let me give you a further example of that. Also in the book of Acts, we have Paul coming to Mars Hill, Acts chapter 17. Paul gets up here in the midst of all of the scholars here at basically the University of Athens, and as he's beginning to converse with them, he notes that they are a religious people, that he is seeing sculptures all over the place, and one of the sculptures that he points out is an altar that has an inscription that says, "To an unknown God," and then he says, "What you worship is something unknown, I am now going to proclaim to you." Now, when you don't understand the cultural context that Paul is resonating with here, you kind of miss how incredible this is. Paul has been touring the city. He has found all of these statues, all of these altars, all of these images of gods from all over the empire that have been assembled there, intentionally assembled so that people can see the great panoply of deities that are worshipped all over the empire. But then he comes to this one and he asks, well, what is this unknown God? And he uses this now as a teaching tool. What's amazing is in that passage, he actually quotes or refers to 3 different classical writers, Epimenides, Aratus, and Ovid. Now, Ovid's the guy I was talking about before, who talked about all this, raping and pillaging of Jove and stuff like that. Well, check out in that same book the opening of the Metamorphoses. Ovid is writing about the creation of the earth. And it's amazing to read this thing and to think that this is actually out of the cultural context of the first century in the church. He talks about that before there was an ocean or earth or heaven or whatever, there was chaos, there's lumpy matter, heat's fighting, wet's fighting, all these things are going on. Now check out what he then drops in. Whatever God it was, the unknown God it was who created the earth, who brought chaos out of, who out of chaos brought order to the universe and brought it all of this, the Lord of all creation marked on the earth, on the globe. And man was born in God's image. Animals look downward, man alone erect can raise his face to heaven. When Paul says, let me tell you about the unknown God who created the earth and therefore has authority over it, he is whipping out 3 classical writers that all of these listeners here at Mars Hill are going to understand. And Paul is reflecting here his understanding of the cultural context, and he is communicating to them very specifically with ideas and names and concepts with which they were familiar, and he is from that pagan foundation building toward the ultimate truth that God is the creator and that Christ is ultimately the fulfillment of all prophecy that has come before. But he starts his argument not with, let me take you to the book of Genesis. He says, let me take you to the book of the Metamorphoses. Let's talk about this statue. Let's talk about the context of this statue. It's just like Dr. Post said, they had a shared context. They wouldn't have had to have 5 minutes of the Nibelungenlied. I think I said it right, didn't I? Close enough. All right. They wouldn't have to have 5-minute summary of the Nibelungenlied. All you'd have to say is the Ring of Power, Wagner, whatever, and there you go. They would all get it. So when he's doing this, it's a cultural shorthand that is enabled by the shared culture that they had and that Paul is able to go tap and resonate. Well, what happens next is Augustine really begins to tap into this idea that we can step back into these different cultures, that we can step back into all of the things that have come before us, and we can go panning for gold. Now, Augustine came to be a Christian late in life. He was one of those who had built a life, built a career, and became convicted of his sin and decided to convert to Christianity. After he had already established himself as essentially a public intellectual, he was well known, he was well respected, he had studied all over the place, had taught in a number of different places, and when he ended up becoming a Christian, he began then to really wrestle with, well, what do I do with all the things that I've learned? How am I supposed to deal with all this? And in passages like this and in other thoughts that were going on at the time, he was able to find a sense that he could in fact use the learning that he had had prior to this experience and begin to pull this stuff out. And he finds justification in it in the book of Exodus. I think it's in Exodus 33. It describes that the Israelites, as they are leaving Egypt, they go and they loot the Egyptians. It's one of those passages I've never seen a sermon on. I don't know why. Pastors are uncomfortable with challenging people to loot, I think. That probably doesn't sound like a good thing. But the Israelites leave Egypt, and as they get onto the road there, they've got gold, they've got silver, they've got other valuable items, including silk and fabrics. And as they then go through and they begin to prepare for what is going to become their settlement, the gold and the silver and the other items they have, the textiles and all, end up becoming what they furnished the first temple with, the tabernacle and the temple and so forth. And so what he says is that just as the Israelites took the treasures of Egypt and restored those treasures to their proper use, which was the worship and glory of God in the tabernacle and in the temple, then what that means is that we likewise are empowered to do that with ideas that have come out of non-Christian places. And so, as you say here in this quote, he talks about that there are studies for liberated minds which are more appropriate to the service of truth. And maybe I could capitalize that truth. He doesn't, but I could. And there are some very useful moral instruction. So he's looking back at this stuff and saying, hey, even in the midst of the immorality that's there, there is moral truth that's there. When Aeneas is wrestling with his desire for Dido in the Aeneid, and Aeneas ends up leaving her behind because he knows that he must fulfill prophecy to found the city of Rome. There's a moral lesson that we can take there about not becoming distracted by immorality, not being distracted by desire or whatever, and understanding that there's a higher calling in our lives. And even though our higher calling is not duty to the state, which is what Aeneas would have said, ours is duty to God. And so we would see that in this opportunity, we are able to worship God and find useful appropriations for all the things that have come before us. Let me build on that just a little bit. Thomas Aquinas says this as well, that reason can take us at least some of the way, and it's the idea that we were created in the image of God, and that because we bear the image of God, there are lasting ramifications for that. And so even those who have not come to understand God fully can still have some intuition that's there, and that intuition is going to take us somewhere. Now, it's not going to take us all the way to the throne of God, but it will take us at least in the direction of God, so that we then are opened up for opportunities like for the Holy Spirit to work and for us to find revelation and so forth. John Calvin talked about this, and what he basically says is that when we discount the writings of those who are not believers, we basically are insulting the giver of those ideas. And he's building up on this idea that Dr. Poe kind of mentioned, which is that imagination can be a tool of the Holy Spirit, that imagination can pave the way for what the Holy Spirit is going to do in the right time through revelation. I love that last line, and despising the gifts, we insult the giver. This all leads to the rise of Christian humanism. Now, Christian humanism nowadays has kind of a bad flavor to it because of, typically we use that as shorthand to mean secular humanism. But during the Renaissance, you end up with these folks, great thinkers like Erasmus and Shakespeare and Wyatt and so many others. And basically what they do is they have a vertical and horizontal understanding of knowledge. First you say, I'm going to understand about God. And one of the ways to understand about God is by looking at all the different things that God has created. And so you look at the created world and you say, I want to understand God better. So we've got the vertical. Now I'm going to go down to the horizontal. I look at the created world and I go, oh, I see. Through science, I can come to understand that God is a God of order, of structure, of predictability. God is a God of revealed knowledge, that we cannot discover anything, we can only find. We can't create things, we can only find things along the way. So what we sometimes will call discovery, people are really thinking, well, I've created that. They haven't created it, they've just found it, they've identified it, and that's what human discovery is really about. The same thing for the human world. So you look at the human relationships, you say, I want to learn more about God, and then you look at God, how can I learn about you? How can I learn more about your character and nature? You look then at people, and you see all the cultural products that we have, you see the uniqueness of humankind, and you begin then to understand that God is a God who loves us and creates relationships, that God is a God of beauty, and that's something that's, again, a very human thing. I don't know that my dog has ever stopped out in the yard and been distracted and going, wow, you know, you might see the moon and bark at it, but I think it's because it thinks it's a big train coming or something. I don't know that it's because my dog is going, wow, what a beautiful moon this is this evening. I don't think there's anything like that. I was going to make a joke, but I'm not going to make the joke. Okay, let me go ahead. My good friend Lee Ryken, who's a professor at Wheaton, talks about this allowing ourselves to participate in things we don't understand by reading other people's ideas. And it's not that we're participating in the term of like sin or something like that, but we're getting this sense of empathy a form of intellectual empathy that allows us to understand our neighbors. Some of y'all may know James Franco, the filmmaker. He has a new movie that's coming out and a direct release to video this week. And it's an adaptation of William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. And one of the things that fascinates me about that book is just the absolute lostness that is in that book. There's no hope of redemption, there's no hope, there's no nothing. It is one depressing book. Some of you may know it as the book that has the shortest chapter in American English anyways. My Mother Was a Fish. That's the whole chapter there, young Vardaman says. Well, Ryken would say we read a book like As I Lay Dying to participate and not emulate, but empathize with those who don't have a sense that there's any kind of redemption available. It's one of the problems we have as Christians. Most of us hang out with Christians all the time, and one of the great challenges we have is we forget what it's like not to know Jesus anymore. Because he's in our hearts, and he's in our minds, and he's in our lives, and it's very easy for us. I was 5 when I came to know Christ, and have very clear memories of it, but what I don't have a clear memory of very much anymore is what it felt like before that moment, because I was not like a terrorist or anything. I was a lying, thieving little kid. You'd be amazed at how much of one I was. That's why I needed Jesus. But I don't remember that lostness anymore. It's been well overshadowed in my life through all the other things that have come through grace. But when I read As I Lay Dying, I am reattenuated to the lostness that surrounds me with my neighbors and my friends and not my coworkers at Union. You can think through that. All right, there you go. So check this out. Christ said in Matthew 15 that it's not what comes into our mouths that makes us unclean, it's what proceeds from our mouths that makes us unclean. Now, is this saying that you can watch anything you want to watch, that you can listen to anything you want to listen to, that you can read anything you want to listen to and have no lasting effects? No, that's not what I'm saying in any way, shape, or form. But what I'm saying is that we need to do something that's called active learning or active reading. We don't passively consume things. Or we should not anyways. Most of us have TVs on all the time. You walk in the house, first thing you do is turn on the TV and it's rolling. You couldn't tell what is on half the time. It might even be this, the 27th time you've seen that episode of Friends, and so you don't realize what's actually happening in that episode. And if you were actively paying attention to what was happening in that episode, you might actually change the channel or turn the thing off. Well, that would be a form of active participation in it. And what I mean by that is discerning, learning, applying the things that are there and being actually reflective on it. And the idea here is that we constantly live a life that is asking ourselves, how can I learn more about God? How can God teach me? How can God prepare me for what I have in store in my life and so forth through what I have in front of me? And then this one last thing. Romans 12 talks about this idea of not being conformed to this age. When we are passive consumers of anything, culture, media, whatever, then what happens is we end up finding ourselves being conformed to the culture that's around us. Did you know there's a study that came out not long ago that your consumption of pornography is directly related to your views on traditional marriage? Absolutely, there's a correlation there because what comes in ends up finding ways to express itself and come out. Okay, that's being conformed, but instead we're supposed to be transformed and renew our minds, discern what's there. All of these are active verbs. Don't be conformed. Don't be conformed. Be transformed, and be discerning, and so forth. So, where does C.S. Lewis fit into all of this? Well, I see in Lewis very much kind of an embodiment of what we see in Augustine. Lewis was a scholar of medieval and Renaissance literature, so it shouldn't surprise us that his view of the relationship between Christianity and broad reading was certainly one of enthusiastic support. I can't imagine walking around in his library and talking to him about anything. It would be such an intimidating act and all. But one of the things that I think I need to stop and pause is just say that C.S. Lewis would challenge us that reading is a joyous activity. And of course, by joy, he meant something that was more than just happy. It was something that really inspired greatness in us, that inspired a desire for excellence in us and so forth. And so any consideration of Lewis has to be conducted in the context of his clear understanding that rational analysis is not always the sole solitary end product of what we're trying to do. Literature is a uniquely human activity, and it brings joy to us. He and J.R.R. Tolkien actually spent a lot of scholarly ink trying to scold people who would beat the life out of literature. J.R.R. Tolkien's greatest work on Beowulf was basically a scolding to the scholarly community to stop being embarrassed because there's magic in stories. Stop being embarrassed because there's a dragon in the story. Embrace your dragonness, he would basically say. And so what ended up happening with scholars, especially post-Enlightenment and especially 19th century and on into the 20th century, was they would absolutely choke the joy out of everything. And that's why we find that a lot of people who go through PhD programs in literature come out the other end very depressed. They're all on Prozac because the life of literature has been beaten and choked out of them. My wife took a children's literature class, and she thought it was going to be this really awesome class, and they ended up spending the entire semester dealing with Freud and Lacan and all this other stuff, and she was like, all I wanted to do was read stories, and they were just basically killing it. And, Lewis would say, hey, look, everybody needs to read broadly because everybody needs to read broadly. It's what makes us human. This is participating in the circle of humanity. It's what makes us human, and it enriches our lives in ways that nothing else can. In fact, many of you will have seen the movie Shadowlands, which is based on a play by William Nicholson. And Nicholson puts some words into Lewis's mouth that are often quoted as being from Lewis, but I don't think that they actually are. Nicholson had Lewis say this: "We read to know that we are not alone." And how many times have we fallen in love with a character in a book? My daughter, I used to catch all of the bookmarks in her books stopping at the last chapter. And one time I said, why don't you finish the books? And she said, because I don't want to say goodbye to the characters. There's a future English professor in there somewhere. I love it. Aren't our greatest heroes literary characters, or sometimes movie characters? Atticus Finch. Don't you want to be Atticus? He's not real. Don't you want to be fill in the blank? Well, they're not really real. It's because we find that human heroes end up letting us down more times than not. We read about historical figures, we read their actual autobiographies, and we find out that they sometimes were not really very nice people. Well, that's what literature provides us with, is a world where we can connect with people and we can suddenly say, I'm not alone. In fact, one of the things I love to say about literature, what makes it distinctive is, tell me a story about an interesting and unique person who's just like me. Don't we all want to fantasize that we are the hero or the heroine of the story? Well, Lewis would say, absolutely, that's right. When we look at literature, we're in error if we do not presuppose the incredible pleasures, both emotional and intellectual, that go through our shared literary traditions. And those are literary traditions from all over the world. So, now having said that, I would also be just as unjust to claim that Lewis viewed text as nothing more than a great pastime. In fact, for him, literature was foundational to rational thought. So I just said he would say, don't get too chummy on the rationality, but he would also say, don't go to the other direction either. We need to be somewhere in the middle and having a balance. And so for Lewis, we see in literature an incredibly rich moral banquet. And that moral banquet allows us to see things that transcend our own identities and our own images. Despite the various corruptions of human good that are depicted in many of the world's great masterpieces, from the sexual marauding of Jove and Ovid to the scandalous bigotry of Shakespeare's villains, Lewis notes that an exhaustive comparison of all those masterpieces also begins to give us an outline of the kind of morality that is actually common to all cultures. And so when we start to explore all of these different things, we call them moral exempla. That's the classical term that we would have. We would read literature and study what is going on in the morality of it, treat it almost as what we would call now a case study. And so you would read a poem or you would read a story, you would imagine yourself in it, you might even rewrite the story in a certain way to emulate what was happening in it and so forth. And so what we end up there is, within that way, is a way that we can compare what's going on all over the place and look for what is good, look for what is gold, and get rid of what is not there. For Lewis, the reading of great literature was a thoroughly moral undertaking. Literature helped to form character by allowing us to examine ideals and failures from a front row, intellectually speaking. And so we could witness someone's moral failing and not actually witness a moral failing. I can't imagine being in a store where there's a gunman that comes in and begins to rob the store. I can't imagine being actually in the store and having to deal with what do I do, okay? But I can read a story that's about that and I can think through that. And then if I'm ever in that situation, then I've already kind of thought through those kinds of things. Well, Lewis would say that this allows us in heroes to see the possibilities that we've never known existed, just as in the anti-heroes we would see the impossibilities or the weaknesses or the failures or the foibles or whatever. We may become what we read, and we will emulate what we have beheld constantly. This is in part the impulse that ends up driving Lewis to become a novelist himself. I don't think that it's a mistake that Lewis starts writing fiction until after he becomes a Christian. He dabbles in it and so forth, but after he becomes a Christian, he gets this great moral vision for what literature can do and how he can affect stories. That's why when we get his conversion tale, The Pilgrim's Regress, it's told as a narrative. It's not told as like this empirical, here's this and here's that and so forth. The problem, he would basically say, was that when we end up studying things and ignoring the transformational ethical power of literature, what we end up doing is creating men without chests. They have intellect, but they have no emotion. They have no ultimate authority to what's happening, and they have no moral compass other than their own light, and that ends up giving us people who are not trustworthy. Of course, he's writing at the time of World War II when he comes up with that phrase, and that is very particularly important at that time. Well, in the book, The Abolition of Man, Lewis describes morality as the Tao. It's basically an ethical code that emerges from looking at how human good can be a revelation for God's design for goodness. The idea is that when we take the world's literatures and we compare the shared elements, the shared ideals, we can cast away the dross, all the extraneous stuff from cultural variations and idiosyncrasies, and we can then see how overlapping virtues begin to emerge, and we can find sort of the really real of moral universals. And so we can then notice the general revelation of God's law to all of humankind, which is sort of what we see in Romans 1:20, which I'll come back to in a little bit, which notes that because of God's power, nature has revealed all of God's power basically throughout creation so that all people are without excuse. And so we can go to the world, we can look at the world, and we can see elements of God. He would say we can do this a little bit through literature as well. And so the Tao means that we can witness God's attributes of justice and mercy and so forth. Now, there is a problem with that. Critics of the Tao note that Lewis is basically embracing a particularly Christian virtue world and sees those in other cultures, but he kind of ignores all the shared immoralities that are in other cultures, because there are lots of shared immoralities in other cultures. My wife and I went to the Yucatan Peninsula, and we went to visit an Aztec ruin. And our tour guide's name was Nacho. I am not making that up. He said, "Hi, my name is Nacho." And I was like, "Oh, of course it is." So we're going along, and I studied this stuff as an undergrad. I took coursework in Aztec and Maya and Olmec and Toltec and all that stuff. And I actually brought my textbook with me on the cruise. How much of a nerd am I? I brought a textbook on Mesoamerican Indians. But I thought I might get to go to a ruin. So we're going to this ruin, and I'm sitting at the foot of this temple pyramid. And I know what happened at the top of that pyramid. The top of the pyramid is where they did the human sacrifice. They used an obsidian blade. They would pop out the heart. They'd hold it up to the victim, and then they'd kick the victim's body off, and it'd roll down the pyramid and all that. I'm terrified of heights. The pyramid is about like that. And my wife looked up, and I'm halfway up the pyramid. She was like, "I thought you were afraid of heights." I said, "How often am I going to get to climb a pyramid? This is so awesome." Well, when we were coming back away from that, our tour guide was describing what would happen on the pyramid and all that, and he was describing the human sacrifice. And I still cannot believe the words that the guy said. He said, "By the way, it was a great honor to be sacrificed. You were the one who was chosen by your village. You were the one who would bring rain and fertility to the crops. What an honor it was for you to be sacrificed for your village." And then he shrugged his shoulders and said, "Who are we to say that they were wrong?" The dude is justifying human sacrifice. And I'm like, with a name like Nacho, I guess that's where we go. That's what we get, okay? Well, we can go to many, many cultures and find overlapping ideas that human sacrifice is perfectly fine. And so are we going to hold that up and say, well, but there's a foreshadowing maybe of Jesus in that? Well, let's see what we can do to justify that. All right, well, here's the thing. Indeed, one of the distinctives of Christianity is not that it's the greatest common moral denominator, but rather that it's something beyond that, a revelation of God's particular grace in the midst of a world dripping in common grace. And such a point hits the mark, of course, but Lewis's basic point about the Tao still stands. It's amazing how much we can see evidence of God's law everywhere we look, when we look with the lens of God's law. Now, some might object that a moral focus is a thin substitute for theological truth, and there's absolute legitimacy to that. But Lewis is not really embracing morality as a substitute for faith. He's following Paul's argument in Romans that morality and the law lead inexorably to an understanding of the utter need for grace. The law constantly reminds us of how much we need something that's greater than the law, and that is grace. Well, that leads me to my next thing. Reading is not merely about what meets the eye. So let me talk about allegory for a little bit. Dr. Post set this up really well. Lewis is all about allegory. I mean, my gracious. My dissertation is on political allegory in 17th century sonnets, if you can imagine that. This is just, I can allegorize the phone book. Okay, you name it, I'm ready to roll with it. You bring it to me, I'll find a story, or I'll find a way that Freud can ruin the story or something. Okay? So Lewis saw great value in the relationship between one thing and another, and how those relationships can yield powerful insights. In literary terms, one means of accomplishing this is through the use of allegory. Allegory is a symbolic system where one term or person or event or whatever is not only literally true, or may be at least literally true, but also is true in a larger sense that gives us some sort of fresh insight. So Christians know this from the way that biblical text does this all the time. John 3:14, for instance, is explicit in saying that when we go to Numbers 21, 8 through 9, and Moses lifts up the serpent, Scripture is specific in telling us that this is a type or a shadow of Christ. It's a prophetic foreshadowing of Christ's crucifixion. In fact, Galatians 4:24 actually uses the word allegory. It's a biblical term. It's a New Testament term. And that references basically Old Testament covenants and foreshadowing of Christ. There's a whole lot of different things that happen there. And so allegory is a perfectly biblically sound way of looking at the world and understanding that what we see is not all that we get. There's more to it than that. Lewis's most important work of literary criticism, The Allegory of Love, works to recover what was a waning understanding of allegory and poetry and narrative. He was dealing with an academic culture that no longer understood anything but the literal. Let that sink in. The heir of the Enlightenment is wooden literality to everything, and not seeing that there are metaphors, there are similes, there are parables, there's all this stuff. And so what he gets there is this idea that allegory is what brings lasting value to classical works in the Christian era. And here he's basically redeeming and vindicating what Augustine was saying, which was, once you get away from the idea that these folks are literally true, that these gods are literally true and need to be literally emulated. And this is what Cyprian and Tertullian were dealing with. They were living in an era when people literally believed in Job, and they literally wanted to embody Job. They wanted to emulate Job. They wanted to do all that stuff. Once we get away from that and we get some distance from that to where what was once viewed as literally true can now become metaphorically a shadow or an allegory of something else, then it opens an entire new horizon. And that's why we get the rise of Western literature following Augustine. Augustine opens up that door for us. And so what Lewis says is that allegory is what brings this lasting value to classical works in the Christian era, because for the first time in the Christian era, this is the Middle Ages and beyond, we're able to read the text symbolically, that we can see characters, events, even ideals, ultimately even pointing to Christian understandings of reality. And so in the Aeneid, when we have Aeneas saying goodbye to Dido and they're weeping and all this back in the castle there where Dido's folks are, and Aeneas and his guys are kind of shuffling off into the boat and trying to get out in the harbor and get away and stuff like that. And Aeneas is trumpeting this idea that he has a duty that's higher than just this lust and desire that he has. We as Christians can come to that and go, yes, we do have a duty. It's not a duty to the state, it's a duty to God. And how easy it is for us to be distracted. When I teach that story, I always talk about this particular girl who tempted me and how I was trying to wrestle through all of that and stuff. And what an awful diversion to my life it would have been if I ended up dating this girl. And this is being videoed, so I got to be really careful about that one. So we'll leave it at that. Don't want too much evidence running around there. All right, so this is the deal. This method of reading, of allegorical reading, then allows a symbolic point of view to review larger truths that might lie behind woodenly literal parts of the narrative or literally untrue parts of the narrative. An inventive narrative might not even be literally true, but it could be figuratively true. An irony that forms a significant part of Lewis's view of the world. In fact, let me just make sure y'all all get this. The best-selling work of the 19th century in America was Uncle Tom's Cabin. the book that single-handedly led to the end of slavery in the United States. But it was a fictional work. It was a work of fiction that contained abstract truth that personified it in a way that helped people to understand what was going on in ways they never had before. They empathized with literary characters where they could not empathize with the literal people they knew in their lives. And this is the power of things like allegory and narrative and so forth. The invented narrative might be literally true, it could be figuratively true, and this is what allows us then to have a poem about love that might not actually be just about love. It might be about a larger thing, such as God's devotion to us, or in the case of the Jacobean court or Shakespeare or whatever, it might even be about politics, it might be about power, it might be about the church, it might be about all kinds of different things. And so the symbolic then sheds light on the larger, more abstract truth that is harder for us to wrap our minds around. So when we read broadly then, we can find these kinds of connections and archetypes and foreshadowings of theological and moral truth that otherwise might not be possible. And so when we look at classical works, or even when we look at what we get later on in the Renaissance and then after that when we get more secular works that are coming out, they can still point us in the right direction, especially if we hold the appropriate keys to understanding all the allegorical correlations. The shared literary traditions that we have and that we can read and that we can understand allow us to see beyond our own limitations, tapping into the larger truths that may not be readily evident. One of my students a number of years ago got a job with the International Mission Board of the home of the Southern Baptist Convention, and her job was to travel the countryside in an Asian country and collect folk tales. She went from village to village with a recording device. They taught her a few phrases in the native language, and she would just basically say, "Tell me your stories. What are the stories you tell children?" She would collect those. They would take them back to the missionaries. The missionaries would transcribe those stories, and then the missionaries would look for points of correlation and thematic things that they could then send missionaries into the villages, and they could say, "Oh, I've heard your story of so-and-so. That reminds me of this story," and that would open up the doors of conversation that would happen there. It was an amazing process that she got to be a part of. Well, this is what we get in these shared literary traditions. In them we can see foreshadowings and parallels and echoes of all the things that are ultimately found in Christian truth. Lewis's view of literature was that it should always convey the magic of narrative, and the magic is part of what allegory is all about. The possibility of non-empirical knowledge or even delight, where love is magical, beauty is possible, but there's also additional meaning there. That the text might just surprise us with a vision that we've never even thought was possible, and revealing to us truth that we had never even known that we didn't know. It's amazing. Well, this leads us then directly to what is perhaps the most amazing view of literature, and that is the idea that literature can be a spirit-led conversion tool. Sometimes just as the law leads us to understand the need for grace, allegory can lead us to spiritual wisdom, and literature can then lead to conviction by the Holy Spirit. Lewis's friendship with Tolkien was one of peers who loved myth and poetry. But at first they did not share the faith. They were on opposite ends there. But Tolkien was a dedicated and outspoken Christ follower who all but pled for his friend to abandon his atheism and embrace the true faith. The thread of their many conversations constantly picked at this issue: one man's faith, the other man's doubt. Prior to his conversion, Lewis felt that the biblical text was just another one of those texts that was out there all among equals and so forth. And this was almost an inversion of the complaint that I opened up my address with by people who don't see any value in world literature. He didn't see any value in Christian literature because he saw it as just another thing. It was valuable, but it wasn't anything special. So Lewis was dismissive of Christian claims of truthfulness in a realm where he saw nothing but equivalence rather than truth claims. Well, on one occasion, Lewis and Tolkien were conversing about the faith, and Lewis said that he saw in Christianity just another invented myth, just like all the other ones that he'd read about. He's like, it's no different than anything else. He saw all of them as ways to communicate truth with a little t, ideals with a little I, but certainly not any kind of exclusive truth claims. He viewed other myths that seemed to parallel the accounts of the biblical tradition as being just more examples of how common this stuff is. But Tolkien, in his immediate